This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Do you believe humans will live on Mars one day? As commercial space companies continue to work on rockets that will bring humans to the red planet, making the trip responsibly is just as important. Coming up, we'll talk with NASA's former planetary protection officer about exploring the solar system without endangering Earth or distant planets. There are thousands of pieces of human-made space debris in Earth's orbit. Will this cause a problem as more and more companies look to put up their own satellites? We'll also talk with the principal engineer in space systems for United Technologies Corporation here in Connecticut about the technology they're creating to aid spaceflight, including how they factor in the question of space debris. First, did you watch the Falcon Heavy, the most powerful rocket that exists today, take off from Cape Canaveral earlier this month? It's made by SpaceX, the commercial spaceflight company run by Elon Musk. If the rocket's launch wasn't spectacular enough, the sight of two side boosters returning to Earth simultaneously was awesome as well. Now, do you think the commercial spaceflight industry has made space exploration more exciting than any government could? Some see benefits to private investment in space, but what are the drawbacks? You can join the conversation, 860-275-7266. Email wherewelive@wnpr.org. Find us on Facebook and Twitter @wherewelive. Now, to tell us more about Falcon Heavy and SpaceX's aspirations, on the phone with us now is Marina Koren, science reporter at The Atlantic. Marina, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
I understand you were at the SpaceX Falcon Heavy launch. Can you describe what it was like to see that rocket lift off?
I was. Yeah, so it was pretty wild. All of the press was kind of sequestered at the press site, which was about 3 miles away from the actual launch pad, which sounds like quite a distance, but that's as close as people were going to be able to get. And so, there was a countdown in my ear, and I was watching this rocket across the water, and when it lifts off, you see it happening before you hear it because it takes some time for the sound to travel, and then it just sounds like this thunderous roar. But what was even louder was those two side boosters returning back to Earth to land on matching launch pads, and they came back with two sonic booms, which was pretty wild to hear.
We actually have a clip of that, and of course it's not going to sound as you were there, but let's hear a little bit of those side boosters coming back to Earth.
There they are. Double sonic booms.
Now, Marina, also the payload aboard the Falcon Heavy rocket is just as memorable. That's because SpaceX CEO Elon Musk chose to have this rocket carry a red Tesla convertible into space, currently floating towards the asteroid belt. Here's Musk explaining why he chose to launch this sports car into space and leave it there.
I mean, it's kind of silly and fun, but, silly, fun things are important. And normally, for a new rocket, they'd launch like a block of concrete or something like that. I mean, that's so boring. And I think that's just the imagery of it is something that's going to get people excited around the world.
So walk us through this whole process of getting Falcon Heavy to launch successfully, and then the idea to launch a Tesla convertible into space, Marina.
Right. So Elon Musk first unveiled his designs for the Falcon Heavy in 2011, and he did it in this tiny, poorly lit conference room in Washington, D.C., with just like this little model rocket of the Falcon Heavy behind it. And many people thought he was a little bit crazy because the U.S. has not had these like heavy launch vehicles lifting off from American soil since, the days of Apollo, since the space shuttle program. And here was this, quirky tech billionaire coming around and saying, I'm going to build a giant rocket. And he said back then that it would launch in 2013, but it turned out to be a lot more difficult to develop this 27-engine rocket. So it took until this February to actually get this thing off the ground. So Musk has always said that it's been a lot harder for them to develop than he thought. And because it's been so difficult, he wasn't even sure that it would work. And that may be part of the reason that he decided to put, his flashy Tesla convertible on there because, it's a nice little show of cross promotion, a little ad for his other company, Tesla, but it's also silly in that, if the launch failed, it wasn't that big a deal because the payload was not anything serious, not anything sentimental. They could just make more Teslas.
This is a $200,000 car, right?
I think so. I'd have to check. It was a 2008 model. I'm not sure how the pricing has changed.
Oh, so it was a little outdated, but something most of us can't afford. But he was able to launch that into space. You mentioned back when he came up with this idea to design the Falcon Heavy rocket, a lot of people didn't think that it was possible. How momentous is this for this rocket to not only launch successfully, but what does this mean in terms of future aspirations by SpaceX and the way that the NASA contracts out to this company?
Yeah, it was definitely a history-making launch. When the space shuttle was launching and when that program ended in 2011, that's not that long ago. And even then, the idea that a commercial company would get really good at launching small rockets like the Falcon 9 and big rockets like the Falcon Heavy into orbit was pretty unfathomable. I mean, rocket launches is the business of governments and nations. And so over the last few years, in a very short amount of time, Elon Musk has kind of shattered that idea, and launches by Falcon 9 rockets, which are his smaller rockets, are pretty routine. SpaceX has spent a couple of years now sending commercial satellites, national security missions, even cargo to the International Space Station. So they're getting pretty good at this, and NASA contracts out to them to get some of their supplies up to the space station. So they're becoming a big player and in the spaceflight industry in a way that commercial companies have never done before.
This is Where We Live. On the phone with me, Marina Koren, science reporter at The Atlantic. We're talking about the successful launch of the Falcon Heavy by SpaceX earlier this month. Now, did you watch that launch, whether on the stream or in news accounts later? What did you think about this moment in space exploration and what it means for the future? You can join the conversation, 860-275-7266. Now, when Elon Musk, Marina, thought to launch this Tesla into space, where was he thinking that it was just going to orbit indefinitely, or was it originally an idea that he wanted to have it go to Mars? This is something that he hopes to do one day with his rockets.
Right, yes. So we all know that Elon Musk is very into Mars, and I've heard people joke that maybe he is originally from Mars and all he wants to do is just get back home, which I think is pretty funny. But so he had, before the launch, he was saying that he was sending the Tesla to Mars. But what he meant by that was that he wanted to put the car into an orbit between Earth and Mars, but an orbit that's elliptical and goes around the sun. So right now, the Tesla is in orbit with everything else, all the planets, comets, asteroids, they're that just orbit steadily around the sun. And a day after the launch, Elon said that the Tesla was moving toward the asteroid belt, so it seems to have kind of overshot its orbit and gone to the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter. But it later turned out that that was not quite correct, and the Tesla is not going to go quite as far out as that. But it is going to come close to Mars at some points in its orbit and then come close to Earth. And it could remain in space for hundreds of millions of years.
You were talking about commercial space flight and the advances there. When we were talking about those side boosters that were able to land after the launch simultaneously, how will that kind of advancement help maybe lower the costs of space flights in the future?
Right. So I highly recommend anyone who's listening to just check out the video of those two side boosters touching down in near unison, because it's just pretty amazing to see. The thing that SpaceX is really good at is reusability. So those two side boosters that returned after the Falcon Heavy launch had flown before. And when you can reuse parts of a rocket, any part of a rocket in multiple launches, that's going to lower the cost of your launch every time. And so that's what SpaceX is trying to do. They're trying to make orbital launches cheaper by reusing most of their rocket hardware. And that's new for the industry. NASA is currently building its own rocket that's going to be much more powerful than the Falcon Heavy, but that is an expendable rocket, and that's going to cost about $1 billion per launch. And SpaceX says that Falcon Heavy launches are going to cost $90 million per launch, and that's a big difference. And $1 billion per launch is quite the amount for something you're only going to use once. So, SpaceX and commercial companies are moving in one direction toward reusability, and NASA kind of is not. And many people say that's a bit of a problem.
Marina, when we were talking about the Tesla being launched into space, we heard a clip from Elon Musk saying that traditionally concrete is used, and he wanted to do something a little more exciting and not boring. But could there have been something else, some other payload that could have been more useful to send up there?
There could, and after the launch actually worked, some people were saying, well, okay, if it's, this thing actually happened and now there is a payload in space, maybe we could have put some kind of scientific instrument or experiment on there, which is an interesting point. But again, I think that SpaceX didn't really think that far ahead, in that they really were not sure whether this launch would actually work. Like even an hour before the rocket took off, there was some uncertainty about it. It really was a toss-up whether this thing was going to go to space or completely go up in flames. So I think that SpaceX didn't want to put anything of too much value on there, so that would look worse if it blew up than if a car blows up.
On the phone with us, science reporter for The Atlantic, Marina Koren, as we talk again about this historic moment in the future of spaceflight. Again, earlier this month, commercial space company SpaceX successfully launched its Falcon Heavy rocket as the first step in the company's goal to carry humans to Mars one day. In a move that only SpaceX CEO Elon Musk could think of, the rocket carried a Tesla convertible into orbit. That's right, a very expensive car is floating around in space right now, which brings us to this question: is this Tesla now just space junk? Our next guest can help us answer that question. Dr. Lisa Ruth Rand is a postdoctoral fellow at University of Wisconsin-Madison, a historian of science, technology, and the environment. She joins us from the studios there in Wisconsin. Lisa Ruth, welcome to the show.
Thanks. It's my pleasure to be here.
So we had a debate when we were talking about this show about whether the Tesla is space junk. What's your opinion on this?
Well, I did want to add a little bit to our discussion of what's up there. And, my initial thought was also, you're setting up this car. Why not, say, offer some space to school children who want to set up an experiment? And I recently discovered that apparently the Tesla didn't go up alone. It contains a tiny quartz crystal disk that's about the size of a coin. That's called the ARC 1.2. It's spelled like arch, but it's pronounced like arc. And it's loaded with Isaac Asimov's Foundation trilogy. And this is a new storage medium that's supposed to last for billions of years. And the creators of the ARC format are hoping that this and subsequent launches of new forms of the ARC will eventually create a kind of a library of humanity that can be decentralized and resilient no matter what happens on Earth. So it's kind of an interesting throwback to the golden record that was on the Voyagers. But this isn't something that's as well known. It's not as flashy or exciting as this kind of strangely random cherry red Tesla that's now out there orbiting with all the other kind of cosmic celestial bodies.
With the dummy astronaut in the driver's seat.
Exactly, with his arm jauntily up on the side of on the window.
Now, you mentioned the golden record. Remind our listeners of these were sounds and languages that Carl Sagan and others helped put together for the Voyager 1.
Mm-hmm. Carl Sagan, the well-known astronomer and science popularizer, along with Anne Druyan and others, undertook this really monumental project to put together sounds that would represent all of humanity to be placed on these Voyager spacecraft that were going out into the solar system and eventually to move hopefully beyond the solar system. And this was a really painstaking, long task of trying to collect exactly the right piece of ancient Chinese music and the sounds of children laughing and mothers scolding and hello in all the different languages. And I believe Anne Druyan even recorded the sounds of her heartbeats to preserve the sound of a woman's heart falling in love, and all kinds of interesting sounds and music to be representative of the human species as a whole. So it was a collaborative project very representative, and it was all etched on this golden record that was placed on the spacecraft in hopes that should alien intelligence someday find this spacecraft and be able to access this record, that perhaps that can be a way of waving and saying, hi, we're here, we exist, know about us.
What do you think those alien beings would think of this flashy sports car if they see it one day?
I have no idea. I wonder if they would try to communicate with that mannequin. But if they're not humanoid looking, they might at least find this crystal disk and find some of Isaac Asimov's work. But who knows? They might look at that little coin-shaped object and have no idea what it is, or what a car would be, or what. There's no reason though why an alien intelligence would be puzzled by a roadster more so than they would be by the Voyager. Really, if you think about it, if you assume that they are nothing like us, this could be just as unusual and strange and stupefying as any other object that one could find in space.
Now, Lisa Ruth, I had asked you if you thought this car would be considered space junk. Maybe we back up and you define for us what exactly space debris, space junk is.
Sure. So this is also puzzling because space junk is currently defined by most state and international organizations as any object that's designed for use in outer space that no longer serves a useful purpose. And that could be objects that remain in space or objects that are falling back to Earth through the atmosphere. So this roadster is also kind of puzzling and historic in that it wasn't designed for use in space. It was designed for use on Earth. And yet here it is in space doing something. Right, it's serving an advertising purpose for Elon Musk's companies, plural. It's especially for a company that doesn't really advertise much, SpaceX. It's providing a kind of an interesting public outreach tool. So one could argue that it's serving a useful purpose, but it's not something that was designed for use in outer space. So it's kind of a tricky thing whether or not this fits into the category of space junk as currently defined, again, by most state and international organizations.
When we were talking about space debris or space junk, so when we think about old satellites or pieces of rockets that are orbiting in space, those are things that are up there now that could be considered space junk?
Right. So space junk typically can be objects from satellites that have run out of fuel to maneuver or no longer being able to communicate with the ground. It can be empty pieces of rockets that are up there. So Marina mentioned that these reusable rockets are making spaceflight cheaper, but they're also reducing to some extent the amount of debris in low Earth orbit. So oftentimes the most dangerous pieces of space debris were these pieces of rockets that still had fuel in them that could explode and create more debris. But it also can be small objects like flecks of paint shed from operating spacecraft or from rocket launches, loose screws, just things that have been shed over the course of normal operations of operating spacecraft.
So we're posing this question whether the Tesla convertible floating around up there is considered space junk. But I wanted to also ask you about another recently launched object. If people haven't heard about this, it's called the Humanity Star. What can you tell us about that, Lisa Ruth?
Goodness, the Humanity Star launched just a week or so before the Falcon Heavy launched, and it was launched by Rocket Lab, another private startup that probably many listeners haven't heard of because SpaceX seems to be the one that has the name recognition. But it's cornering the market for smaller payloads, the nanosats, small commercial satellites. And their latest launch, they launched a few commercial payloads, but secretly piggybacking alongside it was this kind of passion project that was designed by Peter Beck, the CEO of Rocket Lab. And it was this geodesic sphere about 3 feet in diameter, made of carbon fiber, extremely shiny. And it was launched into space purely to be seen from the ground by anyone around the world with the naked eye. And Peter Beck called this the Humanity Star because he saw it as an opportunity to sow unity between people in a moment of high discord around the planet, that perhaps those looking up into the sky and seeing this small winking object from outer space might feel a sense of cosmic wonder, but also feel a sense of camaraderie with people around the Earth who might be seeing the same sight.
Can't we get that from the stars and planets that we can see now without having this strange satellite that reflects the sun's light back towards us?
Arguably, yes. Except that what makes Humanity Star different is that it is artificial, right? It's something that can also show off the ingenuity of humankind, but also, of course, I would argue that the success of our capitalist system, right? We have these entrepreneurs putting up, as Marina mentioned, again, this kind of unprecedented moment where these entrepreneurs are doing the work that used to only be able to be done by governments that had the resources and the capital to do this kind of work. So Peter Beck put up this object, of course, eclipsed by the cherry red Tesla soon after, but also spurred its own controversy. So he kind of, in many ways, the Rocket Lab portrays this as a piece of space art. But astronomers in particular have spoken of it instead as space graffiti, as something shiny and perhaps aberrant that might suggest that would be misleading if they're trying to observe other objects, again, like you mentioned, naturally occurring objects, stars, planets. Instead, it could be something that gets in the way of those kinds of observations. And that's something that astronomers have been concerned about since the very beginning of spaceflight.
I wanted to go back to Marina Cloran, science reporter at The Atlantic. We were just talking about the Humanity Star, this satellite with this created to reflect the sun's light and so people can see it from Earth. Marina, I guess the question I have is how, when people are able, who have the money and the resources to put these things up in space, who's regulating it? How is he able to launch this up there? And, does that raise greater questions for the future of what can exactly go up there and who's watching?
That's a very good question. And I think that increased regulation is going to come with time. Like the more we have people like Rocket Lab or companies like Rocket Lab and SpaceX launching unusual payloads into space, I think maybe some politicians who are fine with it now. I mean, there are some regulations in place about what you can put into space, but I mean, a Humanity Star is not that different from a satellite, and those can easily go up. I think when the cadence of these types of launches increases, then you might start to see some rumbling about increased regulation, and that always happens when the technology outpaces what the law says. And one thought I loved that Lisa called the Humanity Star space graffiti, or that pointed out that others have called it space graffiti. And it is different from the moon, from the stars, from the planets. It's different because it's artificial. But I would say that if you're looking for an artificial piece of something, a sign of human engineering and ingenuity in the night sky, you can still look out for the International Space Station, which might be just a little bit brighter than the Humanity Star.
Good point, Marina. And Dr. Lisa Ruth Rand, again, I guess if people don't like the Humanity Star, the good news is it'll be gone in about 6 months.
Yes, it's supposed to be up for 9 months total.
Okay.
And it will then re-enter the atmosphere, and it shouldn't survive. It's pretty small. And Marina is right that the International Space Station, I'm actually a big fan of going and watching the station. It's about the size of a football field as opposed to the 3 foot in diameter Humanity Star. So NASA actually has a website called Spot the Station where you can sign up with your zip code, and it will send you alerts either on email or on text when the station is passing overhead. So whenever it passes over Madison, Wisconsin, I always like to go outside on a clear night and look up and think, not only, wow, that's something that humans made, but also, wow, there's people up there, which is an added thrill of being able to wave at the astronauts as they pass overhead. So it is really an incredible experience.
This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. I want to thank Marina Cloran again, science reporter at The Atlantic. We'll tweet out some of the links to her stories about Elon Musk, SpaceX, and also the Humanity Star. Marina, thanks so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Lisa Ruth Rand is a postdoctoral fellow at University of Wisconsin-Madison. She studies the history of space debris. She's going to stick around as we learn more about the stuff humans have left behind. We're also going to talk to an engineer with United Technologies about the stuff they're creating to aid the next generation of space flight. Now, have you thought about all the space debris above Earth? What are the consequences of having that stuff floating around in space? You can join the conversation, too. 860-275-7266. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live.
This is Major Tom to ground control.
This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Today we've been talking about the future of space exploration. One of the consequences of humans' interest in space is the amount of space debris or space junk floating around, like old satellites to spent rockets to other artificial fragments. NASA says more than 500,000 pieces of this stuff is being tracked as it orbits the Earth. But what about the space junk that's too small to track? And what kind of damage can this debris cause on pricey satellites or the International Space Station? To help answer those questions and more from the studios of Wisconsin Public Radio in Madison, Dr. Lisa Ruth Rand, a postdoctoral fellow at University of Wisconsin-Madison, studying the history of space debris, historian of science, technology, and the environment. Lisa Ruth, we were talking a little bit about what exactly is space debris or space junk. But when we talk about what exactly is orbiting around the Earth, tell us about the other things we'd find up there besides satellites, besides the International Space Station.
So we'd find any number of things, anything that's been used to send up a satellite or to send up human spacecraft. So that can range from pieces of rockets, from things shed from those rockets, from satellites. A lot of times the debris that can be the most dangerous, the debris that comes into close proximity of the International Space Station, is debris left over from collisions and explosions. So those can be intentional or unintentional. In 2007, the Chinese space program sent up a projectile to bring down one of its own defunct weather satellites, and unfortunately that didn't go as well as they'd hoped, and it created a plume of hundreds of thousands of smaller pieces of debris that continue to circle the planet. And then again in 2009, two satellites, one functioning, one not, collided over Siberia and created two new plumes of debris. So these on-orbit accidents can create small pieces of debris that nonetheless can be extremely dangerous to functioning spacecraft because many of them at low Earth orbits are traveling at speeds of up to 7 to 8 kilometers per second. So that's very, very fast. And there's an analogy that NASA uses that a piece of debris smaller than half an inch around or so traveling at that high of speed would hit as hard as a bowling ball moving at 300 miles per hour. So as you can imagine, that packs quite a punch.
You mentioned low Earth orbit. Talk to us about the multiple levels in Earth's orbit. We have a picture on our website from NASA that shows a lot of the things up there that are just circling above Earth, and I guess that's low Earth orbit. But talk about the different levels and how valuable that real estate is, so to speak, as you go further up.
Sure. So low Earth orbit is anything under about 2,000 kilometers, and it's one of the most heavily trafficked regions of orbit. It's also one of the most crowded with space debris. But there's also different regions of orbit. There's middle Earth orbit, which is where our GPS satellites currently exist, and then there's an even higher orbit, one that some listeners may have heard of. It's called geostationary orbit, or GEO. And it's at about 35,700 kilometers above the surface of the Earth. And objects in that orbit orbit the Earth at the same speed that the Earth turns. So objects in that orbit appear fixed above a point on the ground. So it's a very valuable orbit, particularly for communication satellites, because there's no chance of outage. Wherever at any point in time, any point of the day or night, that satellite will be overhead. So that said, there's only 360 degrees of it, so it's limited. It's not quite like low Earth orbit where things are constantly moving at that very fast speed and circling the Earth and going behind the Earth. This is a very, very valuable orbit that's also rapidly filling.
You mentioned the possibility of collisions up there, and I'm curious, with the International Space Station, how do they avoid being hit by some of that debris?
So luckily, we have a pretty good tracking system in place from the ground and from space, that there are sensors that are deployed by the Department of Defense in particular that track all objects in outer space that are above a certain size. So objects larger than 10 centimeters can be tracked by our space surveillance network. And the NASA Orbital Debris Program Office estimates that there are some 500,000 particles between 1 and 10 centimeters in diameter, but there are probably over 100 million or so particles smaller than 1 centimeter. And currently, there's a new sensor to replace what was once called the space fence, which was not really a real fence, but a kind of a dragnet of radars in the American Southwest that was used to try to pick up on objects that were passing overhead. the new space fence is supposed to be able to, using a different kind of radar, to pick up even smaller objects. So we're trying to get a good sense of what's up there, where it's moving, when, but there also has to be, of course, probability calculations to determine how close an object might get to, say, the International Space Station or to a space telescope, to make sure that that those in charge can determine whether or not the astronauts need to take shelter, whether a satellite needs to be moved a little bit to avoid a collision. That happened actually in 2012 with the Fermi Gamma Ray Space Telescope. There was a high probability that a piece of space debris would come into contact with that telescope, so its operators took the highly risky chance of basically lighting up its thrusters and moving it a little forward in its orbit to make sure it would be protected. That they were more concerned about it colliding with that debris than blowing the whole works by lighting something up that had been frozen for a long time. So there's ways of both keeping an eye on what's up there and also predicting where those objects might be at any point in time.
This is Where We Live. On the phone with me, Dr. Lisa Ruth Rand, as we talk about space debris or space junk up there orbiting Earth, including many satellites. Also, we know the International Space Station is up there as well. Is this something that you've thought about? Do you wonder about the consequences of humans' interest in space and what's left up there? You can join the conversation, 860-275-7266. I have to ask you, we were talking about possibility of collisions. That was part of the plot of that movie Gravity and the Kessler syndrome, I understand. So this chain reaction of one collision with space junk causing another collision and another after that. Is that a realistic fear? Is it overblown?
So gravity itself is overblown. What's shown in that movie is pretty much physically impossible. That over the course of minutes, our entire satellite infrastructure would be destroyed by this cascading collision known as the Kessler syndrome. That said, it's not impossible that these cascading collisions will begin in the future. Donald Kessler, for whom Kessler syndrome is named, was a researcher at NASA who predicted that these might start. He made the prediction in a publication in 1978, I believe, late 70s, and presumed that these collisions would start by the new millennium, and they did with that 2009 collision between the two, the one functioning and one non-functioning satellite. So. It's what happened in Gravity is pretty much impossible. But the eventual outcome of satellites having these domino effect collisions is not impossible. It would just take place over a much longer time period and would not be as catastrophic. And honestly, one of the biggest differences, I think, with that movie and what would happen in real life is that the biggest concern wouldn't be threatening, the lives and bodies of these uncommonly beautiful astronauts, but threatening these just a plethora, really a plurality of technological practices on the ground that you and I engage in every single day, but don't realize are connected to satellites.
Again, we're talking about space debris with Lisa Ruth Rand. I wanted to bring into the conversation now Gary Adamson. He's a principal engineer with space systems with UTC Aerospace Systems. That's United Technologies Corporation. Gary, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you.
So tell us what UTC, we know that NASA and private companies are spending billions on this technology used in space. What kinds of things is UTC building? And when we think about space debris, how you take that into account when you're designing certain technology that NASA will be using up there.
Okay. Yeah, so we're at UTC Aerospace Systems, and we make environmental control and life support systems for astronauts in harsh environments that we need to protect them from the danger of space.
So like a spacesuit?
Like a spacesuit, exactly. And also the International Space Station we've been talking about. So we outfit all the heating ventilation equipment, the fan flows and oxygen generation. But like you said, a spacesuit is a very visible, like a one-person spacecraft. And, so we have astronauts out there. And, we're very concerned about the debris in the environment that we have to live in.
When we talk about this and all the things that are floating up around there, tell us about some of the technology on the ISS that, while it's, I guess, considered more internal, so the plumbing, so to speak, but in terms of if there were a collision, like how they would be able to deal with that with the
Right.
technology you're creating.
Yeah, so we have designs over time. We've looked at ways to protect against these micrometeors, and over the last many decades since the 60s, these been existing from naturally occurring meteors, and these are very small particles though. So we can design for things up to like 1 centimeter or a millimeter in size. Think of like a poppy seed or up to a blueberry maybe, but those things going at 17,000 miles an hour are very difficult to deflect or stop. So we can protect. So the space station has hundreds of bumpers on them, or protection for cooling tubes, for batteries, for electronic equipment, things like that. And there are safe zones for the astronauts to go into. So as Lisa was mentioning, there's a tracking system. There's thousands of debris, and they can track up to 10 centimeters, which is roughly like an orange size or a softball. So we know where those are. We can actually maneuver. So we get a warning, and you can actually you can move the space station orbit to avoid these objects. And we can design for very small objects. The danger, though, is in between the 1 centimeter and the 10 centimeter objects. We cannot see them, and we cannot design to protect. So there's a probability. We need to do a probability risk assessment. And what is the probability we may have a puncture in a space suit or a space station?
I understand UTC is also working with NASA on technology for a crewed mission to Mars. What can you tell us about that?
Yes, right. So as we're trying to live longer in space, expand the human's presence in space, we need to live there longer. So we're designing the Orion space vehicle right now that will be launched out, towards the moon and beyond. That will then hook up with a larger transit vehicle that we will, have astronauts in, a crew of 4 to 8 people. And that's what you would go in a ship. It'd be fairly large, similar to a space station kind of a voyage. To prepare for that, though, we're using the space station in low Earth orbit as a test bed or to experiment, so we know that these systems will survive the trip to Mars. But this space debris is accumulating over time. It's getting more and more of it. So it is becoming more of a risk. And as we spend longer time in space, there's more of a chance that you're going to get hit. So the probability is actually increasing.
Now, we're talking about space debris in this larger context of the future of space flight and space exploration. I'm curious if you watched the Falcon Heavy launch, and what do you think about the future? Is this something that's front and center for most Americans? Are they thinking about what's happening up there?
I think that this does make it front and center, and then, little things like the Tesla, it made me think a little more about, space junk and, what we actually launch in space. And, he obviously was doing a test launch, so, but the primary effect here is he's lowering the cost, as you mentioned, of access to space, and so we're going to be able to have better observation of Earth's, science and communications, and then also, have more human action in space. And we look at, things like space tourism or space hotels in low Earth orbit, and again, these would be, at risk if we, don't get control of the actual debris.
I want to go back to Lisa Ruth. We were hearing Gary talk about the dangers of more and more of this debris. Possible ideas to clean it up. You mentioned shooting it down is not always a good thing.
Right. So, the act of taking down that satellite, on the surface, the purpose was to bring down a dead satellite, to do something good, to clean up after yourself. But it was also serving an additional purpose of kind of showing those around the world that China had the ability to bring down a satellite, right? That's a very powerful skill to be able to show from a national defense standpoint. And shortly after, a few months after, the United States did the same with one of its own satellites to show China that we could do it as well. Again, it was a failing satellite. It was a satellite that was behaving erratically, and we took it down a little more cleanly than the Chinese did. But it served a dual purpose, to bring down the satellite, but also to show that we have the ability to take down your satellite. Now, that kind of dual purpose, that dual meaning, is something that also complicates any possibility of bringing down debris, because by international treaty, the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 declares outer space as the domain of all humankind. And while space itself can't be owned or claimed by any person or state, we can own things transiting through it. And any action against another state's spacecraft could be seen as an act of war. We don't want to do that. So while there are multiple interesting ideas for how to bring down or remediate space debris, they're all very, very legally tricky. But they're also really interesting. Like, for instance, NASA's developing a kind of debris cleaning mechanism that's based on how geckos' feet can grasp objects. There's one company that's basing a removal model on ancient Japanese fishing net technology. The Swiss are going to hopefully soon, over the next 2 years, be launching they call it the Clean Space One spacecraft that is going to grapple a nanosatellite and bring it through the atmosphere to where it'll be destroyed. So there's lots of interesting new models for how to bring back space debris ourselves rather than waiting for the atmosphere to clean it up for us.
This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. I want to thank Gary Adamson again, Principal Engineer, Space Systems for UTC Aerospace Systems. Thanks for coming in to tell us about some of the work that you and your team are doing.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thanks for having us.
Now, coming up, billions are being spent on technology to send humans to the moon and beyond. But what's the safest way to do that to protect not only the people, but the environments we have yet to discover? NASA's former planetary protection officer joins us, and we want to hear from you. If you had the chance to travel in space, would you take the opportunity? Join the conversation, 860-275-7266. This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Today we've been talking about the future of space exploration. But what happens if we leave stuff from Earth on another planet, particularly planets we think may be capable of supporting life? Joining our discussion right now is Dr. John Rummel, Senior Scientist at the SETI Institute, former Planetary Protection Officer for NASA, and a former scientist for astrobiology at NASA. Dr. Rummel, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
I understand, again, you used to be the NASA's planetary protection officer. The Washington Post called this job the, quote, greatest job title ever conceived. Tell us about the idea behind planetary protection.
Well, it's funny, the idea behind planetary protection includes it being described by popular science as the worst job in the science. So we go either way, but the idea is to keep microbial contamination from going from one world to the next, which in the case of what we call forward contamination, taking things to Mars and places like that, could confound our ability to discover life on Mars or to protect that life if we did discover it. We also worry about things coming back, the so-called Andromeda strain, although that was an Army project in the movie. It is one of those things that taxpayers have a right to have sample return missions done safely. And I think that's the kind of investment you want to make. So the planetary protection officer basically puts up a hand and says no in both directions.
We've been talking about the role of commercial companies in space flight and the future of space exploration. What are your concerns as we move forward in this way in terms of taking into account these very important questions and consequences of our actions?
Well, I think that the regulatory environment's got to include the consideration of microbial contamination both ways. And as long as it does that, I don't have many concerns. Of course, if you want to take tourists to Mars, you don't want them to get the Mars flu and not be able to come home. So that's always a concern on the seriously commercial side. And of course, if we're going to colonize Mars, for example, although I think Connecticut's nicer than Mars,
Thank you.
You would find that taking Earth microbes there where they could actually be the confounding element that keeps you from using Mars resources, etc., isn't a good idea either. So we try to go ahead and have some rules. The rules are both government and private rules under the Outer Space Treaty, Article 6. So we, are seeing how we're going to do it. And the U.S. government is a little slow to react on this, but it's working on it.
Earlier, we were talking about Elon Musk's Tesla that's now floating around towards the asteroid belt. Some popular press commentators were complaining that this car wasn't decontaminated. Is that really a concern?
It is a concern if one were to worry about it hitting Mars. Actually, SpaceX provided enough data to prove to the FAA that it was very unlikely to hit Mars in the future. Of course, all the aliens on Mars are going, oh, I wanted a Porsche. But anyway, it's one of those things. We take it very seriously, and it was part of the licensing process whereby FAA consults with NASA on launches of that sort.
I wanted to go back to Dr. Lisa Ruth Rand, who joins us from Wisconsin Public Radio Studios. We're talking about the role of planetary protection. You know, when you look at the history, I'm just curious what your thoughts are moving forward, Lisa.
I think that Dr. Rummel has a really good perspective on this as someone who's been responsible for, again, both protecting other planets from our own microbes and protecting ourselves from it. I do also want to add, in addition to Andromeda strain, that it's not necessarily widely known, but there's a brief moment in Night of the Living Dead, the very first kind of germinal zombie movie, that the zombie contagion is started by a probe that's returned from Venus, a human-made probe that crash lands and causes the dead to reanimate. So this kind of anxiety has been in popular culture for a while now. But as far as the Tesla goes, it does seem unlikely that it would crash land and carry microbes to Mars or to another celestial body. But I agree with Dr. Rummel that the current regulatory framework probably isn't as expansive as it needs to be to cover this new world of private space industry, particularly given that these individual CEOs like Elon Musk, like Beck from Rocket Lab, Peter Beck, that there's that there needs to be also more oversight. That the lack of bureaucracy, relative lack of bureaucracy, does kind of change the game in terms of what goes up and how carefully vetted those spacecraft are.
So who takes that first step in strengthening those regulatory procedures? I'll go back to Dr. John Rummel.
Yeah, I actually think that all the commercial firms that I know of are interested in regulatory framework that they can depend on. So making sure that regulatory framework is not actually likely to be fractured by new ideas coming up that are actually very old ideas is a responsible thing that can be done. And the National Space Council will discuss this tomorrow down at the Kennedy Space Center. I think that it's important that the idea that you can, have a clean entry into Mars and do that at the same time that somebody else is trying to look for life there, you've got to be very careful about misconstruing life from Florida as life on Mars. And that could stop actually regular colonization or regular tourist visits, etc., because you don't want to mix humans and Mars life without knowing about it.
Mm. So, Dr. Rummel, what you're saying, is it really possible to have a mission to Mars that wouldn't violate this principle of planetary protection?
Well, we actually do that with the robotic missions all the time. And all of the robotic missions that have flown since we've been going to Mars, at least by the U.S., have fully complied with guidelines that are published by the Committee on Space Research, which is a not-for-profit non-governmental organization that is under the International Council for Science. Essentially, we try to keep track of what would be considered harmful contamination under Article 9 of the Space Treaty, although the idea pre-existed the Space Treaty.
We'll have to leave it there, but hopefully we've sparked our listeners' interest in what's happening in the future of space exploration. I want to thank Dr. John Rummel, senior scientist and also former planetary protection officer for NASA. Dr. Rummel, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Also, Lisa Ruth Rand, postdoctoral fellow at University of Wisconsin-Madison, a historian of science, technology, and the environment. Thank you, Lisa Ruth.
Thank you very much.
Today's show produced by Carmen Baskoff. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Thanks for listening.